That's fine. So yes, her and I would call her entire life a swim upriver. She overcame quite a lot. Oh, and she had the struggle with identity issues. Not that we ever talked about it, but it's clear from the things that I've learned about her. And sort of and seeing how she changed and did not change throughout the years.
Hmm.
There's the sort of warming up to her culture and like being embracing that, but still sort of shunning the like more spiritual or like story driven parts of our culture, which is a
Okay,
big part of it. But she would embrace the ceremony part of things, the
I see.
singing and drumming, the community, but sort of never really warmed up to this idea of story or myth.
Hmm.
Um, and I do think, so it was clear to see like there's a struggle with identity and finding her place in it when she had
Yeah,
been taught to sort of like reject it for a long time.
sure.
Um, but she was never one to accept being told what her place was ever. So it was every time I learned new stories about her from her or from her children, it was always a wonder to see.
Hmm. Part three, the totem is the hummingbird, representative of beauty and joy. And you write about, Pocahontas, which is the famous Disney movie, and just, blatant, I mean, stereotypes, but blatantly offensive stereotypes. The idea of like both siding, giving, was it John Smith, giving like the other side, the British, the white, the man, the Europeans, and songs that I think there are two songs I believe you write about that are in the movie that are called Savages. Savages Part One, Savages Part Two.
Yep.
Um, and this is straight from your book. Quote, um, other derogatory, demeaning words towards natives, like dirty, shrieking devils, for example, are used 24 times. 46 times, I think, was savages. I cut
I
off my
think so.
notes there. As a child, I took every one of those gut punches just to enjoy the only slice of representation I connected with in life or on screen. And I did so while singing along, unquote. Man, that last line, and I did so while singing along. I just wonder now how you look back at those times where there was representation of a strong female indigenous Native American figure, but you also write about how, the history of it was badly mangled in the movie. But just, you know, almost bragging about wanting genocide and not almost they were and dirty shrieking devils and savages and all those words you use. I just wonder about looking back and having some sort of representation, but also it being that particular representation.
I think it's one of those things that to me it shows why representation is so important because it wasn't even really good representation. It wasn't even it was harmful and it wasn't Pocahontas's for all that they tried is not the main character of that story. She
Mm,
does not have a character arc or growth.
I see.
That is all John Smith. And
Mm,
so it might be called Pocahontas, but the character arc is John Smith.
right.
And Pocahontas is fully realized she's perfect. And so it's this idea
Mm,
of there's this lack of representation for being able to see yourself in that place. It's like that is the perfect unattainable. That is not somebody that has flaws or grows.
mhm,
So that's part of it, but it's also of course harmful stereotypes um and a really bad mangling of history that
mm,
if that's the only thing that anybody knows is that movie, they have a horrible understanding of the actual
right.
story.
Right.
And so as a kid, I think it just shows how important it is that we have representation. That it was one of the movies I watched all of the time,
Mm,
even though it was not. It hurt me to watch it at
mm,
times.
yeah.
I was never comfortable during the songs, the Savages songs, um, or really a lot of other places like little one-off moments. I
Mm,
talk about in the very beginning. There's a scene that was burned into my mind that I knew was coming even before even in a rewatch years without watching it.
mm,
It because John Smith decapitates a mop that's meant to be suggestive of a
mm,
of a Native American, and while singing about it, like while singing about killing. the line is, I believe, we'll
Mm.
kill ourselves an engine or maybe two or three.
Mm.
Um, and I knew that was burned into my brain because it was such, such a significant hatred
Sure.
eh, by somebody that's supposed to be a hero,
Yeah.
by somebody that's not the bad guy.
Yeah.
And so it's, yeah, I struggle a lot with that having been the only representation that was really available to me at that time.
Mhm. Thank you for that. There's a parallel arc in the hummingbird part with Hazel Sampson. She was the last native speaker of the S'Klallam language. She died in 2014, 103. You can imagine the things she saw in her life. You write about the certain key words that you spell out in the S'Klallam language, and an inability to pronounce them. It's a tough language. It brought me back to my college linguistics classes with glottal stops and all those things.
Yeah.
Um, but I wonder about this idea of, of a language literally, not having native speakers, I think is the term you used. Correct me on the terminology. There's a very particular term for, it could be like I could pick up the language, which I can't, it sounds like, but I could hypothetically pick up the language, but it wouldn't be as a native speaker. I guess about the importance of Hazel Sampson and the fact that the language is dying or dead.
Yes, I believe it is, because there's a difference between a dead language and then I forget the other term. So one is that if nobody speaks it
Mm-hmm.
regularly, and the other is what S'Klallam is, which is um, that there are no people that were taught to speak it as a child.
Mm-hmm.
There's no native speakers left. It's all people learning in classes.
Right.
Um, and so it is one of those struggles of losing a big part, like there's because now it is all academic study. It
Mm-hmm.
might be they can learn people can learn conversational language parts of it or try to learn, become as fluent as possible, but ultimately it's not people growing up with this language and learning it from a young age. It is
Mm-hmm.
learning it academically, which
Mm-hmm.
is inherently different. It
Right.
means it's no longer a living language.
Mm-hmm. That's the term. Yeah. Thank you. You finished the hummingbird part with your mom as the hummingbird. She's flitting around like the hummingbirds do. She's not able to walk and she excuse me, the hummingbird's not able to walk literally, right? They this
Yes.
idea of stopping to rest, and your mom is a doer and a giver and so compassionate, as you write about. And just a really cool connection with your mom, the generation before you, as the hummingbird, which so many of us see as beautiful, and as you write about, joyful and beautiful. The raven is the end of the totem, the top. And so part four really is about like the ending of the culture, and I hope hope it's not the end, but it's an ending, or right, an
Yeah.
endangering, right? um you talk about how the raven myth has a different, like so many myths, has so many different versions, but the raven is a woman in your particular version. I
Yes.
wonder about the raven and the myth in the way that you see it.
I think, as I talked about before, the myths are all slightly restructured. They are repurposed in a way that is still I believe true to the heart of it, to the soul of what the story is.
Mm-hmm.
But sort of crafted around. Yeah, that's why I did not call them the legends
Sure.
of these totems. It is a legend. It is one version.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and these are my versions. And so with Raven is my totem, and I do make it clear that this idea of, to me, the legend of the myth is this idea of spreading knowledge or
Mm-hmm.
understanding, and preserving something through sharing it.
Mm-hmm.
The light is my tribal history, is my family, is all the things that the book is sharing, and all the things I hope to continue to talk about and share and bring to light for people outside of my culture.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because the more people that know about it and witness it, the longer it stays.
Yeah.
Um, and so that has always been sort of a connection to me, is this, and it's not done I'm glad that it has the ability to serve purpose for others and to help other people and to be a light for others. I
Mm,
did it because for me, I did it because I didn't want my culture to go away.
sure.
I wanted to have that memory in a physical form so
Yeah.
that it would be harder for people to forget.
Like we talked about earlier, you cite the stats like in the 1960s about the study said that about 25 to 35% of Native American children were given up for adoption. You talk about blood quantum that was, involved too, where the more Native American blood, the more often given up. Of those 25 to 35%, about 90% of the adoptive parents were non-native. Obviously, there's so much culture, so many centuries, years of myth and story and history lost. You write about the stats for Native women as victims of abuse. Highly overrepresented in the stats, and like you mentioned multiple times, who knows, because of like a justified distrust of law enforcement and the government about being underreported. I know that abuse is always underreported anyway, right? Domestic
Exactly.
violence and stuff. And I appreciate you really sharing in the book your own individual story with Jonathan, I guess a boyfriend, and he was unrepentant. He was violent first with his words and then clearly with his actions. And you write about a really, really, really scary situation in which he went very, very far. I just wonder, again, thank you for sharing that, and you can say as much or as little as you want, but I just wonder about the process, or how difficult or how much you wanted to make sure to include your own personal story, as painful as it was.
Um, yeah, I don't think I'll talk too much about that, but I will say just I knew as hard as it was to share and as hard as it was to write about,
Mm-hmm.
I knew that having a real story
Mm-hmm.
and having that would be important for people to understand that it's not just statistics.
Sure.
I think that hearing the human side of things and what actually happens makes things more real for people. Even people that mean well don't always fully understand until they see it in
Right.
a personal interaction.
Right.
And so it was a debate on whether or not I was going to include it.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to do the most good, and so I knew that as hard as it was to share, it was important too.
Well, thank you so much again for sharing. I mean, a very selfless act that I'm sure so many people will see themselves in that, which is unfortunate, but also hopefully a source of strength. You write about, like you said, you want to make sure, like, hey, this is not just something in the past. Forced sterilization, for example, in the 1970s, and you wrote about your own doctor's appointment with the doctor who was seemingly pretty flippant about, like, yeah, we could sterilize as well.
Yeah.
Towards the end of the book, there's a letter to the seventh generation granddaughter, which was one of the standouts of the book, highlights of the book. What's kind of the history of the seventh generation and looking that far ahead?
Yeah. So there's a lot of tribes that have done that for many many generations. It's the idea of making sure that the actions we take today, and the actions that the things that we focus on and work toward,
Mm,
are bettering not just our lives but our lives for the next 7 generations.
mm,
Our great 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 grandchildren. Those are the people that we have to think about, and that's how a lot of many tribes make decisions and make and choose where to focus or how to structure things.
mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. I mean, you write about very, very bluntly, very honestly that you're not sure about, wanting to have kids. And so there's something there about, about you being 1/8 and 1/16 would be the product if there were to be a kid, but it also would have to, unless but there are only 542 tribal members left, right? So the idea of two mates with skull and blood is pretty low. You write about there are 297 of the members with 1/8. So really dwindling, unfortunately. What if you're eighth what if 8 or 9 generations down the line they read this book and they say, come on, how come you didn't think of me? Seven is that symbolic number, huh?
Yeah, I think that's the thing is that like this, the seven generations is is always is like what we're taught to think of, but
Uh-huh.
it really does just sort of project you to the future because seven generations is already so, little time, but also so much time when
Oh
you think
yeah.
of how quick things go. And so,
Uh-huh.
so 8 or 9, it's even 7 was hard to really think about. And
Mm.
so thinking even just another 25 or 50 years beyond that
Yeah.
is yeah, it's like I'm not even sure what the world would look like once again. How much does it change in
Seriously.
that time?
Seriously. Yeah, the second to last part of the book is was so, oof, pardon the pun, was so moving. Had to do with infrasound, which was so interesting. It's I'd love for you to talk a little about it's the definition of infrasound and kind of its effects. It wasn't exactly, I don't think, what you're writing about, but it made me think of like, you know, I mean, obviously this would be true for many Native Americans about the idea of like trauma in the bloodline. You talk about like Holocaust survivors and their kids, their grandkids who didn't experience it, but almost like there's a literal trauma that is passed down in the genes. But I just wonder about like infrasound again, how you would define it and its use in your book.
Yeah, infrasound as a definition is, I believe I don't have the book in front of me, but I believe it's just below 20 hertz.
Okay.
Uh, so it's just outside the range of human hearing,
Mm-hmm.
but it is still a sound that we can sense, for lack of a better word. We feel
Right.
it. Um, and it's usually associated with or found in uh, things that would cause us to have a sort of like primal fear. So tornadoes, earthquakes, tiger roars, tsunamis, all of those typically carry sort of this undercurrent of a very deep sound um, that we are inherently afraid of. Like
Mm-hmm.
humans have, it is that sort of like stomach dropping dread that it creates.
Yeah, so interesting. This idea that whether I or we have ever literally felt that there's this idea that there's these vibrations that this idea, this difference between, or the connection between the physical and the mental and the emotional, right?
Yeah.
The last part of the book is kind of you putting yourself in the raven role, or similar to it, and that the raven is also known as like a trickster and adaptable and clever, and in kind of in line with the way that you've moved around a bit, but really found your voice, really found your family history, your lineage, so many interesting stories, and gosh darn it, in the end, able to pass it on to the reader. I wonder about your rationale in the last part as kind of putting yourself in the raven role, if I'm understanding that correctly.
Yeah. I think, I wanted to it's interesting because all of the other sections I do the similar thing of facts about totem animals and comparing them with the women that they represent. And it's harder to do when it's yourself. It's harder to say, like, here are the places in which I align. And so I think I just sort of spoke to the experience of connecting with my totem a little bit more and putting myself in that like space and also exploring the space between Raven in Western culture as an omen
Mm-hmm.
and this sort of like uh, not quite but almost evil figure or sometimes straight up evil figure
Yeah.
in Western cultures, whereas in native culture, in my native culture at least, in many others, it's the idea of a trickster, and so it's not evil. It is maybe self-serving,
Mm-hmm.
or it's kind of this idea of not altruistic, but not evil, still
Mm-hmm.
helping. It's still a helpful entity. And so sort of exploring the space between that and where do you fall, and how are all these actions interpreted.
Mm-hmm.
um and also I think just sort of the idea of acceptance of self I think is very prevalent in that.
Yeah.
And it's like it doesn't matter what anyone else may see me as. This is what I know I am.
Mm.
That comes up, I think, a lot in that essay, sort of the realization of being Native enough.
I appreciate that. I hesitated to even say the last part as if I'm, giving away the ending, but I'm not. There's so much of the book that I can't adequately describe. It's such a, on a craft basis, like I talked about, it's so cool with the building of the totem and the symbols. There's so many interesting things about history, so many interesting things about the Pacific Northwest in particular, about the S'Klallam in particular and their way of life, and some of the other tribes in the Pacific Northwest, and the way that there's, have been self-sufficient for so long. And obviously this idea that Native culture is still very much with us and alive. So I just want to say congratulations on a heck of a debut. You would
Thank you.
be more than justified to just be like, oh, I'm done. But I'm sure but I'm sure you got some other work in you. I'd love to know what you're working on in the future if you want to share.
Yeah, I don't have anything. I have stuff that I'm working on, nothing that's ready for like sharing yet, but I
Mm,
have a another nonfiction book in the works, as well as further down the line, less developed, is a hopefully a fiction novel as well. So I'm very
okay.
excited to be writing again, be uh back in the creating phase instead of editing phases. It's always a fun place to be.
Very cool. Very cool. Again, congratulations. It was awesome talking to you, and I wish you great luck with your writing and everything in the future.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Been such a pleasure today to speak with Leah Myers. Continue good luck to her with her writing. So looking forward to continue to follow her career and her important work. I can never say that phrase. Thank you for listening to this episode. You can now subscribe to the Chills at Will podcast on Apple Podcasts. Please leave a 5-star review. You can also ask for it by name using Alexa and find it on Stitcher, Spotify, and on Amazon Music. Follow me on Instagram where I'm at Chills at Will Podcast, or on Twitter where I'm at Chills at Will PO1, the number one. Leah, I'm so bad at asking. Please tell us about any social media for yourself. Any Twitter, Instagram?
Yes, I have Twitter and Instagram. Both are at Native Wordsmith, so at N8V_wordsmith. On Twitter and Instagram. I also have a website where I link to any online publications that are available, as well as my social media and any books. That's Leah Myers, LeahMyers @.com.
Awesome. I'll definitely make those links in the episode notes. Obviously we can buy your book anywhere. But I wonder if you have any particular bookstores or special places where we should go buy your book.
I am always a fan of shopping locally. Any local bookstore, they should be able, if they don't have it, they should be able to order it.
Mm-hmm.
Or for people that don't have a local bookstore nearby, bookshop.org, I believe is
Mm-hmm.
.org, will basically order through the nearest local bookstore or through a bookstore you'd like to support. And they'll be able to order it as well. So I would always recommend that.
Awesome. Remind us of the publisher.
The publisher is W.W. Norton.
Of course. Thank you for that. You can watch this and other episodes on YouTube, the Chills at Will podcast channel. Sign up now for the Chills at Will podcast Patreon. It can be found at patreon.com/Chills at Will podcast Peter Riehl. My last name is Riehl. Check out the page that describes the benefits of a Patreon membership, including cool swag and bonus episodes, including, I'm hoping, as we were talking about Tommy Orange, hopefully an upcoming episode about There. Thanks in advance for supporting my one-man show, my DIY podcast, and my extensive reading, research, editing, and promoting to keep this independent podcast pumping out high-quality content. The intro song for the Chills Will podcast is Wind Down Instrumental, and the other song played on the episode is Hoops Instrumental by Matt Whitehour, and both songs are used through archesaudio.com. Please tune in for episode 215 with Nick Fuller Guggens. Nick is the author of the novel The Great Transition, and his short fiction and essays have appeared in the Paris Review, Men's Health, The Sun, the Los Angeles Times, and elsewhere. He works as an elementary school teacher, and this episode will air on December 5th. For now, thanks again for listening. I hope that these uncertain days bring you texts by writers with mad skills, like Leah Myers, whose work, like Thinning Blood, gives you chills at will.